Moscow, 1963. The war has been over for 18 years. The Soviet Union has spent all of those years telling the world that American Lend-Lease contributed roughly 4% of what the Red Army needed to win the Great Patriotic War. 4%. A rounding error. An afterthought in the official ledger of Soviet sacrifice and Soviet victory. In a journalist's apartment somewhere in the city, two men are talking. One is Konstantin Simonov, the wartime correspondent who covered the Eastern Front from the first weeks of Barbarossa to the fall of Berlin. The other is Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, the man who organized the defense of Moscow, who planned the encirclement at Stalingrad, who stood in the ruins of the Reich Chancellery and accepted Germany's unconditional surrender. When Zhukov says something mattered, it mattered, because they are speaking candidly, the kind of conversation men have when they believe they are alone. They are not alone. What neither man knows is that the KGB is recording the room. Every word going into a file that will be sealed for nearly 30 years. And what Zhukov says into that microphone, a microphone he cannot see, is this. Today, some say the Allies didn't really help us. But listen, one cannot deny that the Americans shipped over to us material without which we could not have equipped our armies held in reserve or been able to continue the war. We did not have explosives, gunpowder. There was nothing to load rifle cartridges with. And how much sheet steel they drove to us. Would we have been able to quickly establish the production of tanks if it had not been for American steel? And now they imagine that we had all this in abundance. That recording was suppressed. No one heard it for nearly 30 years. This is what it was hiding. Born to a peasant family outside Moscow in 1896, Zhukov was conscripted into the Imperial Russian Army at 19, survived the First World War, and joined the Red Army in the chaos that followed. By 1939, he was commanding a Soviet army group to a decisive victory over Japanese forces at Khalkhin Gol on the Mongolian border. By December 1941, he was the man standing between the Wehrmacht and the Soviet capital. By the spring of 1945, his name was on Germany's instrument of surrender. By the war's end, medals ran from his collar to his hip. When he said something mattered, the question was never whether to believe him. The question was why he could only say it to a microphone he didn't know was running. The weight of that question begins in the summer and autumn of 1941. Operation Barbarossa opens on June 22nd of that year, and within weeks, the scale of the catastrophe is beyond anything the Red Army's commanders had prepared to face. Entire army groups are encircled and destroyed. The Soviet Air Force loses thousands of aircraft in the first days, many of them still on the ground. Divisions that exist on paper in the morning do not exist by nightfall. The Soviet nervous system fails before the body does. Desperate shortages of radio equipment sever command from command, regiment from regiment, battalion from the front line it is supposed to be holding. The industrial heartland bleeds away behind German lines. The areas now under Wehrmacht occupation had produced 38% of Soviet grain, 84% of its sugar, 60% of its sunflower oil, nearly 40% of its cattle, 60% of its hogs. The food was already scarce before the invasion. Stalin's domestic policies had already cost 5 million lives to starvation, and now the most productive farmland in the country is feeding German soldiers. The Soviet war economy does something that has no precedent in the history of industrial production. It dismantles entire factories and relocates them east of the Urals, piece by piece, on flatbed rail cars, in winter under air attack. The factories will be rebuilt. But between the day they stop producing in the West and the day they begin producing in the East, there is a gap, a silence in the machinery. And into that silence, the pipeline begins to flow. By December 1941, Lend-Lease tanks, British Valentines, British Matildas, early American arrivals, constitute somewhere between 30 and 40% of Soviet heavy and medium armor before Moscow. That figure deserves a moment's pause, but it demands honesty alongside it. Moscow is held by Soviet soldiers in Soviet tanks in temperatures reaching 30 below zero before the American pipeline is anything more than a trickle. The battle for Moscow belongs to them. What comes after is a different story, and a longer one. To get American steel to Moscow at all is itself an ordeal that the official history of the alliance rarely examines. There are 3 routes. None of them is simple. The Arctic convoys are the shortest. They are also, for a period, nearly unsurvivable. The convoys run north of Scandinavia, threading the Barents Sea through ice fog and darkness at temperatures that freeze the rigging and turn spray into armor on the hull. German U-boats work the approaches. Luftwaffe patrol bombers sweep the horizon. In 78 trips across the course of the war, the Allies lose 85 merchant ships and 16 warships on this single route. Hundreds of men go into the water. In Arctic temperatures, survival is measured in minutes. July 1942. Convoy PQ-17. 35 merchant ships moving east under escort, carrying tanks, aircraft, ammunition, vehicles. The British Admiralty, fearing a surface attack by the German battleship Tirpitz, orders the convoy to scatter. The escort turns west. The merchant ships, now sailing alone, are hunted down one by one. 24 of the 35 are destroyed. By submarines, by aircraft, by the simple arithmetic of exposed ships and concentrated German attention. The sailors who survive spend days in lifeboats in the Barents Sea. Many do not survive. Among the cargo on those ships, 417M 3 medium tanks, built in American factories, packed into holds by American workers, now resting on the floor of the Arctic Ocean. They would never fire a single round. In the official ledger of Lend-Lease deliveries, they are noted as lost in transit. On the seabed, they are something else. The Trans-Iranian route is safer. It is not short. 50 days from the Persian Gulf to the Soviet front lines, over a motor highway built across Iran and through a railway system, remade into a major artery for American cargo. Slower than the Arctic. Survivable. By the end of the war, more than 70% of all Lend-Lease cargo arrives by this route. The long way round, through heat instead of ice, through different dangers. The Pacific route, through Vladivostok, carries its own constraint. Japan and the Soviet Union maintain strict neutrality toward each other for most of the war. Only Soviet-flagged ships can use this corridor. Only non-military cargo travels this way by ship, which means the Alaska-Siberia air bridge carries what the hulls cannot. 8,000 aircraft fly this route before the war ends, each one piloted by a Soviet aviator who has crossed half the globe to take delivery and flown it home alone. At Murmansk, at the end of the Arctic route, a port city wreathed in ice fog receives convoy after convoy through a winter darkness in which the sun barely clears the horizon. Now, the dock workers are mostly women and teenagers. The men have gone to the front. They work in Arctic cold, in the dark, operating cranes that swing tank after tank down from the decks of ships whose hulls are scarred with ice and patched with emergency welds. The tanks come down on chains, swinging slightly in the polar wind. Soviet reception crews stencil red stars on them and drive them onto flat cars before the harbor freezes around them. The first American tank the Red Army receives in significant numbers is the M3 Lee. It arrives in 1942. And from the moment Soviet tankers see it, the reaction is complicated. The M3 is a massive machine. It stands nearly 3 meters tall, the tallest tank on the Eastern Front by a wide margin. Its hull is riveted, which was already considered antiquated when it was designed. A rivet struck by a shell can shear off inside the hull and become a second projectile. Its main 75mm gun is mounted in a fixed sponson on the right side of the hull. It cannot traverse fully, which means the tank must maneuver its entire body to bring the main weapon to bear. There is a second 37mm gun in an upper turret, giving the machine an ungainly, multi-tiered profile. The Red Army had seen a great many tanks. They had not seen anything quite like this. The Soviet technical evaluation of M3 Lee No. 304293, which arrives in February 1942, is candid to the point of bluntness. The evaluators write, "The tank is too tall, and the vertical positioning of the armor plates gives the tank poor protection against artillery fire." This is diplomatic language. The nickname Soviet tankers give it in the field is less so, grob na semik, and a coffin for 7 men. But Soviet commanders are not looking for elegance. They are looking for what the machine can be made to do. And what they discover about the M3 Lee is that its greatest liability, its cavernous interior, can be repurposed. The evaluators note that the space can accommodate the 7-man crew and also carry 10 additional soldiers armed with submachine guns, all weapons firing simultaneously. The coffin for 7 becomes, in necessity, something closer to an armored personnel carrier for 17. A lumbering, riveted machine made formidable through sheer volume of fire against German infantry who have nothing to stop it. It is never a solution. It is a stopgap. But the Red Army in 1942 does not have the luxury of waiting for solutions. The Sherman arrives in November 1942, and the difference is immediate. A Soviet tanker in early 1943, accustomed to the T-34, approaches an Emcha for the first time. The smell reaches him before anything else. American paint, American grease, a slightly different diesel exhaust from the twin General Motors engines sitting under the engine deck. He climbs the hull. It is higher than he is used to. He drops into the turret. There is room. The T-34's turret is famously cramped, 2 men wedged over the gun breech, barely able to move without touching each other. The Sherman's 3-man turret is almost spacious by comparison. There is a padded seat. There is an auxiliary generator that keeps the batteries charged without running the main engine, which means no more draining power overnight in the cold. No more dead radios at first light. There are American wrenches, labeled in a language he cannot read. The diesel engine settles it. The Red Army runs on diesel. Diesel is harder to ignite when an anti-tank round punches through. The M4A2 variant, the one shipped almost exclusively to the Soviet Union, uses a twin straight-6 diesel configuration producing around 400 horsepower. American forces never use this version in combat. The U.S. Army prefers gasoline engines for logistical standardization. The diesel Sherman is built specifically for export. The variant the Soviets come to call their finest Lend-Lease machine is a tank America built for them and never fielded itself. The Stavka, the Soviet High Command, takes notice. The Emcha begins going to Guards formations. The 1st Guards Mechanized Corps, the 3rd Guards Mechanized Corps, the 6th Guards Tank Army, the best units in the Red Army. As when the commander of Soviet armored forces formally requests that no further M3 deliveries be made and that all future shipments be M4A2 Shermans, the Americans comply. Lieutenant Dmitry Loza is one of the men who receives them. He commands Shermans from the autumn of 1943 through the end of the war in Europe, and then across the Gobi Desert into Manchuria. He will have 3 shot out from under him. He will fight from Ukraine to Vienna. And for decades, his account of what it was like inside that tank sits in a manuscript drawer, suppressed, unpublishable, waiting for a country that no longer exists to release its grip. Loza notices everything. He notices that the Sherman's gun sight is recessed into the turret, protected from the weather in a way the T-34's is not. And he notices that when one of the 2 GM engines is disabled in battle, the The coupling joint can be disengaged from the crew compartment, and the tank can crawl away from the fight on the engine that remains. Half dead, it can still move. He also notices the Thompson submachine guns packed inside each Sherman, caliber .45, which he calls a healthy cartridge indeed. He has watched soldiers fire these weapons at each other during an argument and seen the bullet bury itself in a padded jacket. He prefers a captured German MP-40. Compact, fits in the turret. You couldn't turn around in the tank holding a Thompson. Alexander Pokryshkin flies what is in front of him, the second highest scoring Soviet ace of the war, 59 confirmed victories, earns nearly all of them in an American Bell P-39 Airacobra. Such a plane the U.S. Army Air Forces has already decided is unsuitable for their own pilots. America ships it east. Pokryshkin takes it, flies it, and refuses to give it back. When Soviet leadership offers him a transfer to a Soviet-built Yak-3 in 1944, he refuses. When the aircraft's designer informs him that the opinion of a combat pilot is of no interest to him, Pokryshkin asks a single question: and for whom do you create your aircraft if you're not interested in the opinion of a combat pilot? He keeps the Airacobra. Then, somewhere in Ukraine in the autumn of 1943, Loza's battalion commander Nikolai Nikolaevich Malyukov dies in his Sherman. T-34 crews, not warned that American tanks are operating in the area, open fire on a silhouette they do not recognize. The machine looks nothing like anything in the Soviet arsenal, and Malyukov dies inside it. Two armies fighting in the same direction, in the same mud, with equipment so different that they cannot always identify each other before it is too late. Loza records it as he records everything, plainly, without commentary. Our troops on the T-34s had not been warned that there were Shermans in the area, and they shot at the tank of my battalion commander. He died in his tank. December 1943. The Tehran Conference. Stalin is at dinner with Roosevelt and Churchill, the three men who between them are managing the most complicated military alliance in history. Stalin raises a glass. What he says into that room, in the presence of witnesses, is this: without the use of those machines through Lend-Lease, we would lose this war. He will not say it publicly again. The state he leads will spend the next 45 years insisting the machines barely mattered. He says it once, at a dinner table, in a room not quite private enough, and then the official story closes over it like ice over a harbor. Behind that official story is a reality the numbers make irrefutable. By the end of the war, nearly 1/3 of all Red Army vehicles are Lend-Lease. 400,000 trucks and jeeps and armored cars that move men, ammunition, and fuel across distances that would otherwise take weeks on foot. Lieutenant Pavel Gurevich of the 6th Guards Mortar Battalion explains in the plainest possible language what the American Studebaker trucks mean compared to the Soviet ZIS alternative. ZISs were two-axle. They kept stalling out on poor roads. Studebakers are off-roads, with both front and back wheels leading, and they came in handy in Karelia's swamps. On those American axles, the Soviet Union mounts more than 20,000 Katyusha rocket launchers, the weapon the Wehrmacht calls Stalin's organ, the multiple rocket system that turns German positions into fire and concussion and silence. The launchers ride to the front on American trucks. More than 1/3 of all Soviet explosives come from the United States, 57% of the aviation fuel equivalent, 55% of the aluminum. These are not the numbers of a footnote, they are the numbers of a foundation. And the Soviet state spends 45 years ensuring they go unexamined. Nikita Khrushchev understands them. He is at Stalingrad as a political commissar. He knows what the Red Army has and hasn't had. After his removal from power in 1964, so he dictates his memoirs in secret. Not into a KGB microphone, not to a wartime correspondent, but into a recorder he controls, knowing the words will have to be smuggled out of the country to be heard. He writes, "Without the machines we received through Lend-Lease, we would have lost the war." And then, no one talks about this officially, Stalin never, I think, left any written traces of his opinion. Stalin, Khrushchev, Zhukov, three men at the apex of Soviet power, all privately saying the same thing, none of them able to say it in public, each finding a different room, a dinner table, a smuggled manuscript, an apartment they thought was unmonitored, and saying it there where they believed the official story could not hear them. Loza's manuscript stays in its drawer. Soviet histories hold the line. To the official percentage, 4%, produced by the chairman of the Soviet State Planning Committee, is what the textbooks carry. 12% of aircraft, 10% of tanks, 2% of artillery. A rounding error. An afterthought. The men who flew the aircraft and drove the tanks know something different, but knowing something and being permitted to say it are two separate things. And in the Soviet Union for 45 years, they remain separate. The Cold War begins almost before the German surrender is dry. Any honest accounting of Western assistance becomes, almost immediately, a political liability. To acknowledge that American material was structural to the Soviet victory is to complicate the founding myth of the Great Patriotic War. The story of a nation that saved itself through its own sacrifice, its own production, and its own will. That story is true. It is also incomplete, and for 4.5 decades, the incomplete part cannot be spoken. Loza retires from the military in 1967 with the rank of colonel. He lives in Moscow with his manuscript. It waits. In 1991, the Soviet Union ceases to exist. The prohibitions on Lend-Lease accounts begin slowly to lift. Loza's book is published. Zhukov's KGB recording surfaces. The work of rebuilding what actually happened, what was in those factories, on those trucks, in those turrets, can begin in earnest. In 2004, a museum opens in Moscow, the Museum of the Allies and Lend-Lease. Among its exhibits, a Willys Jeep donated by the son of Soviet Marshal Rokossovsky. American-made, still operational, occasionally taken out for a drive. And a collection of buttons, Soviet uniform buttons, of the kind worn by Red Army soldiers across 4 years of the most violent war in human history. On the front of each button, a red star. On the back, stamped into the metal in English, in a language most of the men who wore them could not read. Made in Chicago. The Alliance, hidden on the back of a button, visible only when you turned it over. The museum is no longer active. Somewhere in Washington's ledgers, meanwhile, the account for the machines is still being settled. The negotiations over what the Soviet Union owed for Lend-Lease had started in 1947, stalled, resumed, and finally arrived at a figure of $674 million to be paid by 2030. Russia, as the USSR's successor state, pays it off in full in 2006, 61 years after the war, quietly, without ceremony. The official history says the machines contributed 4%. The debt for them takes 61 years to settle. The account and the official story never intersect. Zhukov said it in 1963 to a KGB microphone in an apartment he thought was private. Stalin said it at Tehran in December 1943, at a dinner table full of witnesses, in a room where the words would never become policy. Khrushchev said it into a recorder in the years after his fall and had the tapes smuggled out of the country he used to run. Loza wrote it into a manuscript that waited in a drawer for the Soviet Union to collapse before anyone could read it. And on the back of a uniform button, in a language the soldier wearing it could not read, a factory in Chicago had stamped the same accounting into the metal. Everything visible was Soviet. Everything underneath was something else. And Zhukov's final words on the recording, Words that took 27 years to reach the people they were meant for are these. And now they imagined that we had all this in abundance. He knew what had kept the Red Army moving. He said it once, to a microphone he didn't know was running. The official history still says something different. The button sits with its red star facing up.